this guide, I'm going to go over the difference between watercolor pencils, and watercolor crayons. This is a deep dive and you're going to learn a lot. So first, I'll go over the supplies, then the main techniques, so you see how all three mediums differ from one another. And finally, I'll be painting the same pumpkin 3 times for a better comparison. Hi, I'm Françoise. Welcome back to my channel. A lot of you guys have been requesting more videos about watercolor pencils and watercolor crayons because they compare so much to watercolor. All three mediums come with pigment, think of it as color, and also a binder that binds all the pigment together, and that is water soluble. And that implies that they all need the addition of water to look like what's known as watercolor. A big difference here is that both watercolor pencils and watercolor crayons are not as known as watercolor, and they're often mistaken for their non-soluble version, which would be colored pencils and oil pastels. And pencils in particular can even easily be used as normal colored pencils. Traditional watercolors are way more popular in the water-soluble department, and that's also why it's so difficult to find information about the other two. And I had to teach myself how to use these first before I could even teach you guys how to do it here. About popularity, I would be the first to say that traditional watercolors, feel and look a little bit more professional. And I also think that they fit large formats better. That's why I've selected this medium for my first solo exhibition. Well, and again, that's my preference. I prefer watercolor pencils and watercolor crayons for smaller projects, for things that are more for fun. And that's why I use them more and more in sketchbooks now. I also adore traditional watercolors because pigments move on a wet sheet a tad nicer than the other two. As if pencils and crayons were a bit chalky, please don't base your choice on that because this is barely noticeable, and I think it's because I'm so used to watercolors that I'm able to tell. But I bet that a lot of people who don't use those mediums very often would not even see the difference. Overall, I do believe that all mediums are interesting, they're great to use, and that's why I feature all of them here. And then I think some of them are very popular for many different things, like art, coloring books, notebooks. You can do a lot of things. Doing something for fun like watercolor pencils and crayons to me doesn't mean that it's not going to be professional, and I hope this video shows you the potential of all three mediums when it comes to that. And if you're curious about how I achieve art like this with watercolor, pencils, or crayons, you may consider joining my Patreon. I have over 200 watercolor and watercolor pencil videos in real time and my voiceover. And I just released my first 2 watercolor crayon tutorials as well. You'll find a link to that in the description of the video. Watercolor painting in general, whether you use tubes or pans for traditional watercolors or pencils or crayons, is pretty straightforward because it's always the same supplies. There's not a bunch of them. And they're easy to carry around, so you can just paint in your studio, at home, on the go, wherever you want. I mentioned water before, so naturally what you will be needing will be painting supplies. For example, watercolor paper will be the best fit to use all three mediums to their full potential. And you probably already noticed that watercolor paper comes in various types, sizes, thicknesses, prices, and you can get loose sheets, pads, blocks, sketchbooks. You can also get very affordable kinds and very fancy ones. And there's a ton of choice of brands, so it gets confusing pretty quickly. So I'm going to be sharing some pointers here based on my preferences, but also on student feedback and what I see other artists saying around me. So for traditional watercolors, I believe that the best option are 100% cotton papers with a minimal thickness of 300 grams per square meter. They come in different textures, so between hot press, cold press, and rough papers, I recommend cold press the most because it's neither too smooth like hot press, nor too textured like rough, which makes it easy to paint anything and everything, and it retains water much better than the hot press kind, for instance. 100% cotton papers are pricey, but they're well worth it. I've seen many established artists and also students of mine agree that they give much better results and a nicer experience where colors just look nicer, they intermix better, there's less chances of seeing marks and drying lines, although it can happen, but it's not as bad as when using other papers. I did witness a few artists who are beyond talented, actually using cellulose papers, the kind that dries so fast that I do not like to use at all. And they do amazing with them. So that just goes to show that depends on the person too. You might prefer those cellulose papers. Other people prefer cotton papers. Watercolor pencils go with virtually any watercolor paper type and even quantity drawing paper. Because a huge difference with watercolors, with traditional watercolors, is that they require less water. That makes them a very versatile medium, and they're also less prone to stains and other things that happen because of the water. And that's why I love them so much, especially in my watercolor sketchbooks, because these generally perform very poorly with traditional watercolors, even when they claim to be cotton. With the pencils, I would only stay away from rough papers because the strong texture makes it hard to color and paint smoothly. But if you're after texture showing in a painting, it could be an asset. Watercolor crayons are an in-between. That depends on what you want to do with them. I use them like I do my traditional paints right now. So right now, I prefer the fine cotton papers, cold press for them. But I think they could be appreciated by some of you guys in sketchbooks or all kinds of watercolor papers. And honestly, I need to experiment a bit more. Big takeaway for you here is that the subject that you pick will influence the type of supplies that you choose for all three mediums. For example, landscapes take a lot more water to create smooth skies, grassy areas, water, things like that, while a simple shape without a background requires less water. So let's say I want to paint a shape with traditional watercolors. I can do it more easily on the papers that I don't like as much, like the cheap cellulose or the cotton hot press papers. It wouldn't be a problem. On the opposite, watercolor pencils might be more versatile, but they will do much better on 100% cotton cold press paper when I go for landscapes. So it's not just about the medium of the paper itself, it's about the quantity of water that you're going to be using for your subject. And that goes for traditional watercolors, watercolor pencils, and watercolor crayons. Before painting, it's common to draw a sketch even if it's very basic, and for all three mediums, I love to use my mechanical pencil, a ruler, and an eraser. Anything basic will do here. For the pencils in particular, and maybe the crayons, if you want to use the tip, a sharpener is helpful. For traditional watercolors, we'll need nothing extra, as you can imagine. Stretching watercolor paper allows you to apply water on it without worrying about it buckling like crazy. My favorite ways to do it are to either use a roll of masking tape, and that goes for all three mediums. You tape it all around like this, and you're good to go. Otherwise, I like to use a block of the size of my painting that is glued on the four sides because I don't need tape and the paper stays flat. But remember that the subject that you pick determines the supplies that you'll use. So for a very simple shape that I know require very, very little water, I might not even use any tape and just use a loose sheet. Whether it is traditional watercolors, watercolor pencils, or watercolor crayons, the paintbrushes you'll be using are watercolor paintbrushes, and you'll be able to differentiate them to oil paintbrushes in particular because they're so much softer to the touch. And it's hard to tell you what to get exactly because there's such a wide variety of paintbrushes, and it also depends on the sizes of paper that you pick. For bigger sizes, you'll need bigger paintbrushes, and for tiny sizes, you'll need smaller paintbrushes. But overall, I'd recommend to go for natural hair paintbrushes or synthetic imitations of natural hair because they take more water than the plain synthetic paintbrushes, and they glide better on paper. Strokes are less visible. And I like to have a flat paintbrush to wet paper quickly before painting. I'd also recommend 1 or 2 round paintbrushes that are going to be large enough to paint backgrounds quickly on wet. For details or painting on dry paper, my favorite types are round and pointed paintbrushes. And for tiny details, I do prefer a basic synthetic paintbrush because it has more bounce and it's great for precision. If you want to see exactly what I use, in the description of the video, you'll find a kit.co link as where all my Amazon supplies are linked, so you can take a look if you like. I'm going to share about paints now because there is a lot of choice and not all paints are equal. For traditional watercolors, I'd recommend anyone starting a 12 or 24 set of student-grade paints. They work really nicely and they're affordable, especially if it's one of those popular watercolor brands. And stay away from the very cheap brands that come with a ton of colors, even if they're nice to try it out. As you get more experienced, why not go for professional paints, especially if you want to make sure that the colors don't fade over time. My top picks for beginner student-grade paints are Daleroni, Sennelier, and as a seasoned artist, I really like the professional Sennelier paints, but also Schminke and Daniel Smith. There are so many brands out there that it's not fair to just point out to just a few brands. These are just my favorite ones, and if you want to experiment, I'm sure you can find a lot of other options for you out there too. My watercolor pencils will include the watercolor and the water-soluble kinds, ink-based, graphite, etc. So my favorite watercolor pencils, and also the most qualitative of all, I think are the Faber-Castell Embrush Durer and the Caran d'Ache Museum Aquarelle. You can find them in open stock if you want to try them out. Otherwise, a 24 color set is better in my opinion because unlike the 12 color sets, it comes with the white pencil, and that's going to be useful to place extra highlights. I also love ink-based pencils like the Derwent Inktense for their colors. I love the Derwent Graphicant as well. They have graphite particles in them, which makes the colors look slightly muted. And finally, the Faber-Castell Graphite Aquarelle are a great asset for black and white paintings or just to place beautiful shadows in a painting, and you'll see me do that in a lot of my videos. I didn't dig into the world of watercolor crayons as much, like I said before, but I do have and tried the Caran d'Ache Neocolor 2. I know they're by far the most popular ones. And I also have the Art Philosophy sets. I enjoy both of them, with, believe it or not, a preference for Art Philosophy this time, because the colors seem more vibrant to me. Caran d'Ache offers an amazing variety, however, and I'm pretty sure that they're available in open stock. But so far, I find I need to add an extra layer to get the vibrancy that I need compared to the other crayons I have. But again, don't take my word for it because I haven't tried all the watercolor crayons out there yet. I think small sets like this one are great to get started. And again, having a white crayon can be handy, although we can always use white gouache or a white gel pen when we don't have one. Other important supplies, what I would call the non-negotiables, would include for all three mediums, water jars, paper towels or a rag, and a mixing tray or a palette. I also always use something to place underneath my painting. It's easier for cleanup and if I need to tape the edges of the sheets. For a traditional watercolor, I notice I'll always use more water and it will get dirty fast. That's why everyone talks about using 2 jars. Big difference with watercolor pencils since I've found that only 1 jar will be enough because of the little water that they need to work. And again, I find that crayons are an in-between. It just depends on how you want to use them. If you want to use them as a coloring tool, you might not need that much water, but if you want to use them like I do, like watercolor, traditional watercolor, then you might need a lot more. And again, it also depends on the subject that you pick. Now to mix colors, I like to use these large trays with my watercolors, again because a lot of water is generally involved. Pencils and crayons feel a tad less runny in comparison. Like I mentioned before, they feel a little bit more chalky, so they require less water. And that's why for them, I find that flat palettes like these work better. The best are palettes that are rough on the surface, because it's easy for the pigment to grab onto it, and these two here are perfect for it. A helpful tip is to wet the palette first, and then it will be easier to make paint out of your pencils and crayons. There are some optional supplies out there that I personally could not live without. A heat gun or hair dryer when you don't want to wait for paint to dry on its own, and things like white gouache, ink pens, or a white gel pen. The heat gun is mostly valid for watercolor. Again, because I tend to use it in the traditional way, and that requires working with a lot of water. That's why the heat gun helps me dry a layer quickly so I can work on the next one right away. For pencils, I only use the heat gun whenever I paint a landscape. This is still because of the amount of water the subject requires. If I just want to color and activate my paint on dry paper, the paint dries so fast that I barely ever need the heat gun. This could also be the case for traditional watercolors, when I paint hair on dry paper, for example, because that dries so quickly too. It's the same for crayons, it depends on what I paint. This pear painting here had a loose background that required it because it was painted on wet. But the pears themselves were painted on dry. It dried very fast and I didn't need it as much. Shadows and highlights are incredibly important if you want to convey some realism to a painting. That's why I'll use things like water-soluble graphite pencils or ink pens to add touches of a dark color to a painting, no matter if it's traditional watercolor pencils or crayons. I'll also use white gouache or white watercolor in a tube in combination to my traditional watercolor paintings. I prefer it far more than the white watercolor pans because at least I'm able to get thick amounts of paints from a tube and create really good and crisp highlights. It's different for pencils and crayons because the white pigment from a pencil or crayon is solid already, and it's easier to create crisp highlights from that alone. That's why I don't use white gouache for those, and instead I would rather dip the lead or the tip of the crayon directly in water to reactivate the pigment a bit and just apply on paper. This part about the supplies was really important to get started, but now let's talk about the actual process and what the main techniques are. Remember, these three mediums are meant to be used with water and that both pencils and crayons are meant to look like watercolors. That's why first I'll share about the two main watercolor techniques to see what's the same and what's different. The first technique that I want to show you is the wet in wet technique. It's when you wet the paper before you apply your wet brush full of paint onto it. It helps create these soft and dreamy effects that watercolors are known for, and it is best for any background or any base layer that you might need in a painting. As you already know, because I mentioned that before, traditional watercolors shine in combination to good amounts of water and the best papers available on the market. And it's especially true with a wet and wet technique. And it's exactly the same for watercolor pencils and watercolor crayons because, again, it all depends on the quantity of water that you'll be using. A thing that I don't love about pencils and crayons on wet is that sometimes a small dot of pigment will fly away and it will end up on the paper. It melts right there, and after that, it's really hard to remove. Doesn't happen all the time, but it's frequent. That's why it's better to pre-wet a palette and have the pigment melt there first before applying it on paper. And I'm talking about large washes of paint on wet paper. For painting on dry paper with these mediums, that doesn't apply. With traditional watercolors, this never happens since the paint is already soft and creamy. That's why they're also better suited to large formats. Thanks to the existence of tubes, you can choose to get the paint directly from there rather than pans. You'll get more on demand. It's already moist too, so it's faster to use if you're in a hurry. And that's why for my exhibition, I decided to only use my palette for the trays, and I only work with the tubes directly and not my pans. So in my opinion, for wet in wet, traditional watercolor wins by far. Another well-known watercolor technique is the wet on dry technique, and it's the one that I've used to compare the three mediums with the pumpkin paintings. The wet on dry technique is when we apply a paintbrush full of wet paint on dry paper. This is great for details since the edges stay sharp. And it's also nice to paint a subject that has no background and target sections rather than an entire sheet. With traditional watercolor, you'll paint just like you did on wet, except the paper will be dry. The trick is to hurry, or soften edges quickly with a clean and damp paintbrush because it all dries very fast. And most times we'll want to avoid a bunch of hard edges, especially for those who want to create smooth effects. The painting comes to life layer after layer. Watercolor pencils are very different here. You'll get to sit back, relax, and just color your subject as if these were colored pencils. What I love is that it's possible to push it to the point the final painting is visible through the coloring alone. Most of the work is done with it. The only catch is to learn and activate the pigment properly to avoid a giant muddy mess. And I teach this in all my videos and classes about pencils. One thing to remember is use very little water and have a paper towel at hand, which is something you won't need with normal watercolors. Watercolor crayons work more like traditional paints in the way I've used them so far. I soften edges as I paint and I build up a painting in layer. I haven't tried them directly on paper, but since their tip is a lot thicker than a pencil, I don't see myself coloring with them and then activate, especially if I wanted to achieve some transparency. It feels risky to use the tip right away on bare paper, although it could be a good idea in later stages. With the process of painting on dry with all three, I find that pencils are the champion thanks to the ability for more control and the fact that it's so relaxing, and crayons come right after. I did love to paint the watercolor version only because I am so used to it, but my impression and memories from when I was a beginner is that traditional watercolor is a medium that takes more getting used to. It's puzzling to work with paint and water for those of us who started out with a pencil. We never know at first how much paint or water to apply, and things dry fast. And once you learn how, though, it's easy and fun. And watercolor being my main medium, I teach all that in my master classes, and you can find links to those in the description of this video if you'd like to learn along. If you like to draw and use dry mediums and you're not into watercolor, give pencils and crayons a go. It will get you used to water little by little. I like everything is easy. For example, there's hardly any chance for wet paint to bleed into another area because it dries so fast. When for traditional watercolor, more care is needed to avoid stains and bleeding. And again, that's because more water comes into play. In the messiness department, I think all three mediums are equal. Wet paintbrushes, wet pencil, or crayon tip is the same kind of minor mess. And I like to use a paper towel to keep my workstation clean. Everything dries so fast that you can carry it around easily right after painting. Other important techniques that set these mediums apart are the ones that you would use to create some kind of texture or details in a painting. Again, I'll place traditional watercolors and crayons in one basket because I use them in the same way, pencils in another because I use them differently, but also because they have a lead. For example, if I want to create texture or detail with traditional watercolors or a crayon, I'll use my paintbrushes 99% of the time. The size and tip of the brush will determine how precise I can be. Pencils are unique thanks to their fine tip because we can create a lot of effects, and you'll find a bunch of videos about that in a dedicated playlist. Among other things, it's possible to either place pencil marks directly on wet paper, or just wet the lead and deposit small chunks of paint for amazing texture and top vibrancy. That's why I love my white watercolor pencil for crisp highlights. Pencils are great for details, and that's why so many people use them in combination to watercolors or just for sketching. A big con is the lead and how fragile it can be sometimes when it breaks. And when that happens, it can be annoying, but thankfully with the top brands, it's pretty rare. One aspect where pencils and crayons are similar is the ability to pick up paint right from their tip with a wet paintbrush. Something that I would not attempt with watercolors since it might end up way too thick, or we might pick up way more than we actually need, and it's just not convenient to do. This is not the case with the other two, and actually quite convenient to touch up the vibrancy somewhere, towards the end of the process. So which medium is right for you then? Let me know in the comments below if you already have the answer or you want to try one of those. If you have a hard time with water or you like more control and normal watercolors frustrate you, for sure pencils and crayons will be a great fit to ease into traditional watercolor later. Same if you'd like to take your sketchbook experience to the next level. Pencils will have a little bit of texture showing while crayons look more watercolor smooth, so that can also be something to look at. And if you're after the pure watercolor experience or you're ready to take on large paintings, I'd go for traditional paints. Start out with a set of pans and slowly switch to tubes as color preferences become more and more obvious. I hope this was helpful. Here's my watercolor pencil playlist if you want more info about them or about any of the other two mediums I talked about today. Remember to check out the description for all the resources, the classes, tutorials that I offer. Thank you so much for watching and see you next time.